As a more casual fan of Star Wars, I get the feeling this ranking is probably going to disappoint or upset some people. With that in mind, I do hope people still enjoy this video and leave their rankings in the comments below. And be sure to support the channel by hitting subscribe and leaving a like. Thank you very much. To begin with, I'll give J.J. Abrams some degree of credit that there was a lot of elements going against him when it came to making Rise of Skywalker. Not only having to contend with a rushed production, but also the passing of Carrie Fisher, and however he handled it was a lose-lose situation. Though I do think they probably could have given some of her role to Lando, as otherwise he feels like a bit of a non-player character in this movie. Having said that, I do heavily argue with the criticism that there was nowhere left to go after The Last Jedi, as there were several elements from that film that they could have easily expanded on here. Firstly, small stuff like having Kylo have to contend with the ghost of Luke constantly being in the corner of his eye and slowly going mad, thus allowing a way for the First Order to fall apart from the inside. Maybe explore something to do with the Resistance potentially having some moral ambiguity. Personally, I would have retconned Phasma's death and have her be shunned by the First Order. She seeks revenge against Finn, but to her surprise discovers that he has matured and actually offers her a place in the Resistance. And most importantly, even if you hated the reveal of Rey's parents being nobodies, honestly you could channel that frustration and disappointment into her characterization, causing her to start making mistakes, doubt herself, maybe have some conflict with the rest of Resistance characters like Poe, expecting her to be something that she isn't. And alongside this, if you really think Finn has nowhere left to go and his arc is now complete, why not have him stand beside her and support her while everyone goes against her? Because he can relate to her situation, the lack of identity, and never knowing who his true family is, but not letting that define him, finding a place with the Resistance, and promises her that she will find that too. I think this is much better than just having him be blindly obsessed with Rey. Not only would this allow Rey the opportunity to complete her arc of finding her own identity, but also when it comes to rebuilding the Jedi, she can learn the importance of emotional support as opposed to emotional suppression or exaggeration and letting them run rampant. I feel the film just throws meaningless fan service and new characters at the problem when there is so much untapped potential that they could have explored. When it comes to The Phantom Menace, while I don't agree with the idea that it's completely skippable in regards to the overarching storyline of the prequels and Star Wars as a whole, I feel this film, and to a lesser extent Attack of the Clones, has a issue of really procrastinating its storyline and not focusing on the right aspects of the story. For example, while it establishes the three main characters of this prequel trilogy, I feel they're barely given any focus. I always think it's weird that Obi-Wan has no relationship to Anakin in this film. It doesn't have to be positive, but the fact that they barely interact is kind of a major issue with their supposed friendship. It doesn't help that they also ended up retconning Darth Maul's death, so Obi-Wan feels even more redundant here. You've also got the breaking the show don't tell rule when it comes to Anakin supposedly being all-powerful with the Force. It's frustrating because there are multiple points in the film where they could have actually shown off his skills. When it comes to Qui-Gon Jinn, I don't think it was necessarily the right decision to have him be the main character, given how little the character is focused on following this film and is barely addressed. Some positives I will give the movie is that even though George wanted to expand the Star Wars visual style with a lot more digital effects, I appreciate the fact that it came out at a point where they still needed a lot of actual practical sets, costumes, and decent amount of location filming. It allows some visual variety rather than just everything being done on a computer. And probably the most controversial opinion I have is that not only do I think Jake Lloyd as Anakin is perfectly fine, but I feel he gives us the best emotional moment when he has to say goodbye to his mother. I just feel really bad for Jake Lloyd and hope that eventually he's able to find some peace, considering all the unnecessary cruelty that was thrown towards him, much in a similar way that Ahmed Best has found peace with Star Wars. There are two ways of looking at Return of the Jedi. Firstly, as an overall finale for this original trilogy, and I feel it really succeeds in being very satisfying in terms of answering the right questions related to these three movies, the most important information, while also leaving a few hints open for subsequent entries in the franchise. It provides Luke and Vader a satisfying conclusion to their character journeys, and hints towards who the Emperor is, but leaving him as a vague, threatening presence here. An interesting, potentially unintentional bit of foreshadowing is the fact that Yoda and Obi-Wan insist that the only chance of winning is killing Vader, but Luke rejects that as he still sees that there is some hope in him. It has the strongest score of the original trilogy in my opinion. When looking at it as a film in its own right, it definitely is the weakest of the original three. It still holds some of the same charm, but definitely has a lot more problems and is a bit of a step down from Empire. I feel the direction is a bit flat at points, and as a result, while the rest of the main characters definitely do things that are important for the story, the fact that it's them doing it doesn't feel important. As not only do we have the weakest performances from Han, Leia and Lando, they don't really get much more development as characters here. Part of me kind of wonders if the film would have been better if they had killed off Han like they originally planned, and would have given more emotional weight to Leia and Lando, I suppose. I don't mind the comedic tone at points, but I definitely feel that more could have been done to make this film a bit more exciting, as at points it is a little dull. Visually, I want to say it's the weakest, or at least least exciting Star Wars film. There are some exceptions like the great puppet for Jabba the Hutt and the model shots, but the fact that most of the film takes place on Endor, which is just a forest, I almost can understand why George Lucas wanted to have more digital effects to give Star Wars more visual variety. But then I remember the Jedi Rock scene and realised how much he abused digital editing. There is some good stuff in here, I can't deny, but overall I do think it could have been much better. For the longest time this was easily my least favourite Star Wars movie. However, more recently I'm able to recognise some of the positive elements which I previously overlooked. For starters, compared to The Phantom Menace, this film manages to get a bit more focused in regards to the ongoing storyline across the prequels. It still has some procrastination, like the ridiculous delegation of Padmé's assassination attempt, as well as making one of the assassins a shapeshifter but doing nothing with it. But otherwise, when you look at it on paper, the actual plot of the film is really solid. What drags it down ultimately is the execution, specifically in the romance of Anakin and Padmé. Due to how it's written and some of it being performed, the actors do their best, but it really doesn't sell them as a convincing couple, and they're just sort of forced together because of the narrative circumstances. With that said, I do feel this film does allow the actors more opportunity to emote this time around, and you can see some hints of great performances in there. It's mostly the actors and John Williams' amazing score doing most of the work to sell the emotion. On that note, I'm really glad this time around Ewan McGregor gets much more focus and has allowed more opportunity to give Obi-Wan some fun character traits. One element I wish got more focus was Count Dooku. He's often regarded as the worst of the prequel trilogy villains, but I feel he has the most potential and depth as a character, being somewhat morally complex, being neither Jedi or Sith. I used to really find how blind the Jedi are to everything going on around them really frustrating, but going in with the context that they are meant to be a broken order with a really ridiculous philosophy that doesn't make any sense, you can see how it sets up their ultimate downfall. I can retcon certain elements like midichlorians as something that they've introduced as part of their religion in order to keep specific people out. What ultimately makes this film much more entertaining these days is all the memes that sprung up after the film was released. Ironic enjoyment is still enjoyment, I suppose. Unironically, my favourite of the Star Wars prequels. Like most people, I love all the action. I feel this does the best work with the characters, selling the relationship Anakin has with Obi-Wan and Padme, and it has easily John Williams' greatest score for the entire franchise. I've got to give particular props to Hayden Christensen. Despite the awkward dialogue, he really helps to sell Anakin's fall to the dark side. As rushed as it does feel, you can see the evil within him. With that being said, I do think it is incredibly rushed and isn't totally satisfying seeing Anakin's fall to the dark side. I do think there was more that could have been done, which is why I'm not surprised the Clone Wars ended up being so good given all the untapped story potential these films wasted. For example, I do wish they had kept in Padme's subplot setting up the rebellion. As much as people don't like the political aspect of these films, there is some really interesting elements to it. As the most consistently great element of this trilogy has been the Emperor, you can poke holes in his plan, but having him play both sides to ensure he wins no matter what, whether it's as the evil Sith Lord or as the beloved Chancellor, the corruption of the system to the point where he is basically handed the power, you've got to admire the cruel irony. Ian McDiarmid's performance is a major highlight. Whether he's understated or over the top, this is a great villain. It also kind of wrote expanded material into a bit of a corner when it came to putting everyone in their New Hope starting positions, despite the fact that there's almost 2 decades between this film and the next. They could have left certain things a little open. I feel the movie shows off just how great the prequels are on a thematic element, but what lets it down is the execution, and figuring out what to prioritize really would have saved these movies, and I would consider them to be probably the best era of the franchise. But as is, I can still find some unironic and ironic entertainment from these 3 films, and in particular this one. In all fairness, given the context of how the sequel trilogy ended up turning out, I am probably being a bit too kind to The Force Awakens, especially given that it is probably one of the more derivative entries in the Star Wars series. I still think it's incredibly fun, even if it's not the most original story. I love how the 3 main characters of this new trilogy are introduced, Rey, Finn, and Kylo, and how this may not have been intentional, but the fact that they were all introduced, not only without much dialogue to establish their characterization, but also not having the access to their face, being masked within their first scene, and we get a good indication who each of them are, and who they're going to be across these films, or at least who they were supposed to be. You have Kylo Ren's inner conflict, being uncertain whether he is on the light or dark side, Finn's anxiety when it came to fighting and rejecting the First Order's desire to conquer, and in my opinion I think it does a great job establishing Rey not only as a skilled pilot, given that she spends her entire life dissecting different forms of starships and knowing their inner workings, but also her isolation, establishing Rey's obsession with her parents and not allowing herself to create her own identity. And something that is important for the next film, her obsession and faith in the mythology of the Force and characters like Luke Skywalker. I've talked about how The escape from Jakku is my absolute favourite moment in the entirety of the Star Wars saga, to the point where it made me realise just how invested I was in these new characters, to the point where I kind of wish the original trilogy cast didn't show up, as not only did J.J. Abrams not give the most inspiring post-Return of the Jedi development, they don't really add much and are mostly just glorified cameos outside of Han Solo. I feel he and maybe Chewie are the only really ones who get much to do here. Also, when Han Solo is killed, my personal headcanon is that it wasn't the rage-filled Kylo Ren that was responsible, but the emotionless Jedi Ben Solo. Given how massive of a franchise Star Wars has become since this original movie came out, what I admire most about this film is its simplicity. It takes one of the most fundamentally well-known basic stories of a farm boy rescuing a princess in order to create a understated foundation that has universal appeal in order to build a massive franchise and have strong world building. Obviously there are hints towards stuff like the Clone Wars and the backstory of the Force and the Jedi and the Sith, but it's underplayed and is used as simply world building, not essential parts of the story that are left unresolved. It gives audiences the freedom to just stop after this film, but also leaves the door open if they want to learn more about this universe. It's a lesson that I really wish other franchises would take from this movie. Take your time with building a massive franchise, as there's no guarantee that the first film will give you enough success. You can laugh at the performances of Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher and think they're a bit cheesy, but not only do they have a charm to them, but it's also contrasted with the gravitas brought by the likes of Alec Guinness and Peter Cushing, alongside Harrison Ford as the swashbuckling hero that brings a sort of understated humour to call out some of the ridiculous elements. It has the best use of R2-D2 and C-3PO, not only acting as comic relief figures, but also characters that really help to push the story. Whenever I watch this film, I'm always in disbelief that it came out in the mid-70s, considering how well it looks visually. And aside from a few technical tweaks, I don't think all the special edition elements were necessary. The model shots, the location filming, the sets, they all stand the test of time. And as such, I can see just why this film is recognised as an iconic piece of cinema. While I'm on the more positive side of the Last Jedi argument, I will concede that there are some elements of the film which I do wish had been improved upon. Specifically the storylines related to the Resistance and Finn specifically. Also, I kind of wish they kept in the Captain Phasma deleted scene, especially given that she's killed off. There is good stuff about it, I just feel it could have been done a little bit better. I do like Rose and DJ though. For me, the absolute highlight of this film is the work that it does for Rey, Luke and Kylo. Now, I can understand this interpretation of Luke being very different to the one in the books and the comic. However, within the context of the films, in particular the prequels, with this film actively calling out the flaws of the Jedi philosophy, I can buy how Luke ended up this way. It gives the impression that not only was history doomed to repeat itself, with Ben Solo being taught the same flawed lessons as Anakin, but also the more of the Jedi philosophy Luke absorbed, the more I can see him being almost tempted to kill Ben, but his own moral compass, which prevented him from killing Vader, stopped him just too late. I love the fact that Rey's parents were nobodies. It gives her the freedom to carve out her own identity and not live in the shadow of some legacy character, but also puts to rest the Jedi philosophy of the Force being something for an exclusive set of people. The movie debates the place for heroes like Luke Skywalker, with Rey insisting that he is their only hope, while Kylo insists that those legends must die. I think the final ultimate message really is incredibly touching, showing how legends can bring hope to the people in the now, but it's up to those particular people to do the actual work, as there's only so much a legend can do, reflected in not only the beautiful scene between Luke and R2 where he shows Princess Leia's message, but also Luke's death itself. The way that he messes with Kylo, revealing that he's not actually there, is incredibly satisfying. And out of all the legacy character deaths in this trilogy, this is easily the best, in my opinion. There was a lot more going against Empire Strikes Back when it first came out, as it was much more explicit about Star Wars becoming a franchise. However, the fact that it was a smash success can be attributed to several major factors behind the scenes, which I feel the rest of the franchise really should have learnt from. Firstly, when it came to expanding this universe and having more explicit unanswered questions, George Lucas made sure to have those answers not only ready, but knowing when exactly he was going to answer them. All these creative ideas really worked thanks to George Lucas's passion to do them justice. So the idea of having the film end on a dramatic cliffhanger, it allowed for a mutual understanding between the filmmakers and the audience, knowing that these issues will get resolved, and as such they feel excited for the next entry rather than disappointed and feeling this was an incomplete experience. However, following on from this, it was important to establish this film as an important entry in its own right, rather than just set up for the next film, by not only having character development for the heroes, but also for the Empire itself, and showing all the different generals which fear Lord Vader, gives them some depth and doesn't just write them off as one-dimensional villains. In fact, the darker tone of this film establishes that it really wants to break away from the fairy tale format that A New Hope had, and showed the reality that even with the destruction of the Death Star, the Empire is still around and isn't going to give up that easily. And finally, actually seeking out support for the areas that George Lucas personally struggled with. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the emotional beats of the story, the romance between Han and Leia, and the reveal of who Darth Vader really is, likely would have fallen flat without the direction of Irvin Kershner. Plus, his general filmmaking is incredibly dynamic, allowing this to be one of the most timeless entries in the franchise.